Meanwhile, Khadan had been pursuing a monarch. The Mongol spy service had discovered that Bela, king of the Hungarians, had survived the Holocaust at the Sayo, and by Mongol custom, the ruler of a hostile nation was to be put to death. The lists of their executions was by then a long one, from Wang Khan of the Kiraits to the Kuchluk of Black Cathay, and the Golden Emperor to Muhammad the Khwarazm Shah and Sultan Jalal ad-Din, to the Volga chieftain Kuchman and the Grand Prince Yuri of Ryazan and Henry of Silesia. Some of these had been hunted down for months, but no one had survived. Bela had moved from his monastery in the Carpathians to the Austrian court. He fled thence to the Dalmatian coast. In February of 1242, the Mongol hunters traced their quarry down to the shore. Bela fled out to sea to one of the islets along the coast. This checked Khadan. His horsemen were not familiar with such a great expanse of water, over which they could not swim their horses, until he commandeered other ships and began to search through the islands. Frightened, Bela had himself transported back to the coast. Khadan picked up his trail again there, and began to work down the coast, slaughtering the small army of captives he had brought with him from Hungary when they hindered his march. First, Bela sought refuge in the fortress of Klisa. Then, hearing of the approach of the Mongol horsemen, he rode to Spalato, where nobles of the Hungarian court had flocked. Fearful, even in that strongly defended port, he fled on to Trau. Khadan's advance appeared before Klisa and fired a volley of arrows into it before dismounting and climbing to the assault. Learning that Bela was no longer within its walls, the pursuers went on to Trau. There they sent a messenger who spoke Slavonic into the town. Khadan, a lord of the unconquered army, bids you know. The messenger announced that you will share the punishment of one who is not blood-kin to you, if you do not yield him into our hands. But Bela had taken to the sea again, sailing out to a small island off Trau, where the Mongol horses could not follow him. Khadan ravaged the coast to the south, and his men attacked the ships that had escorted Bela out. When they were driven ashore by a storm beyond the Danube, Subutai waited, ready to move into Western Europe at the first appearance of a hostile army. Then, at the end of February 1242 of the Common Era, a courier from the other side of the world reached the camp of the old Mongol general and put a stop to all operations. The courier carried a gold tablet of command, and the message he brought to Subutai was this: the night at the Blue Lake, more than 4,000 miles away, the Khakan Ogadai had lingered in his summer quarters by the Blue Lake, where the waterfowl gathered, the wild geese abandoning their summer haunts in the tundras, passed south, crying out. Clouds of sand grouse swept by on the heavy winds between the gusts of hail, and Ogadai drank in his gold-studded pavilion. Even after the first flurries of snow, he stayed at the lake to hunt. At times, after a drinking bout, he lay speechless and weak, but he would not follow the birds toward his winter palace. His elder brother, Chagatai, was no longer at his side. Chagatai, the wild horse, was feeling his age. A nomad at heart, he kept to his mountains in mid-Asia. He had opened new roads through the ranges, winding down to the 5 cities, joining the different Mongol dominions together. His granaries were full, his people kept to the Yasa of Genghis Khan. With nothing to concern him, Chagatai built artificial lakes by his mountain camps, so that, like Ogadai, he could watch the bird life gathered there, and he listened to the messengers from the Western Army telling of the fortunes of his warrior son and grandson, Baidar and Buri. Then, too, the wild horse had fallen under the influence of a wizard who could subdue the spirits of the high and distant places and invoke the stars, a wizard named Sakaki. Sakaki could lay an enchantment on a city that would keep fires from burning, and he could summon into Chagatai's tent of nights an army of fire spirits armed with flaming weapons. If a man doubted Sakaki's power, he forced him to kiss the tail of a dog. Once, when a flight of herons passed overhead, Chagatai had lifted his bow to shoot at the birds. When the wizard touched his arm, "Which would you like to see fall?" he asked. Glancing up at the herons, Chagatai saw that there were 5, the first and the last, he said, and the middle one, whereupon Sakaki made a sign with his finger on the ground and struck his hands together. The 3 herons that Chagatai had picked out fluttered and fell into the grass. Chagatai bit his fingers in astonishment. He could not understand the power of the wizard, and he feared him. Sakaki was careful to keep the old Mongol away from his brother's court. Now, one of the things is you can kind of learn patterns and appearances and stuff, and you can make predictions based on that to a degree. Rather than some sort of foreknowledge of how the birds are going to act, in a prophetic sense or whatever. The burden of administration in the East had fallen upon that wise Githaean, Eliu Cha-Utsai. With Ogadai ailing, his task was doubled, and he had little time now to play the dozen lutes that were his hobby, or to write verses to his confreres. He had he had to struggle against plausible strangers who came to Ogadai's feet with schemes for aggrandizement and still more fabulous profit, and he had to tread with great care a middle ground between the ideas of the elder Mongols and Turks who believed in government from the saddle and the growing Chinese element that sought to convert the Mongol Khans to the ritual of the Chinese Empire. On the Nobad Mongol side, Tarakina, the favored empress, was gaining the ascendancy because Ogadai was still patient with her whims, and Tarakina saw no reason why the Mongol court should not wax more wealthy. Herself the fountainhead of the new prosperity, she was partial to a shrewd Muslim, Abdurrahman, who pledged himself to collect 2 million ounces of silver yearly from the conquered areas in China if he could be given the tax administration that was in Yeliu Utsai's hands. Against Abdurrahman's scheme, the Githaean argued passionately, knowing what grinding oppression would come to the Chinese with the farming of the taxes. "Are you trying to stand against us?" Ogadai demanded fretfully. "Do you weep for those people?" "I weep," Utsai replied, "because the misery of the people begins from this moment." When Ogadai lay on his couch in the Golden Camp without rising, Tarakina came to Utsai's quarters to ask how government was to be carried on with the great Khan lying helpless. For 30 years, the Githaean answered, "I've carried it on by doing what was reasonable and punishing what was wrong. The Khan trusted those affairs to me, but now that he is ill, Tarakina suggested new edicts are needed. Without a decree of the Khan, nothing can be altered. The Githaean would concede nothing to her growing insistence or to the whispering of her adherents." Ogadai recovered a little as winter settled down on the steppes, but he would not leave the tent camp for civilized quarters, and against Utsai's urging he rode off to hunt again. When he mounted his horse, a Mongol shepherd came to his stirrup to complain of a wolf that had been killing sheep. Hearing that, the Mongol beaters, assembling around the Khan, carried up to him a wolf that they had just trapped and bound. For a moment Ogedai stared at the gray beast, twisting in its cords. Then he ordered a flock of sheep to be given the shepherd as a reward, and, on an impulse of his own, he told the beaters to release the captured wolf. I will let him go, Ogedai said gravely, so that he will go back to the other wolves of the pack and warn them of the danger that came to him. Thus, they will all leave the countryside. Those who heard Ogedai did not know if he were still drunk or if a whim had seized him. They freed the wolf and let it go, only to see it seized by a pack of dogs before it could get clear of the camp. The dogs killed the wolf. Ogedai seemed depressed by this happening. Dismounting, he went back into his pavilion and was silent a long time. He refused to think of hunting. My strength fails, he said at last. I thought that the sky might be willing to let me live longer, but I see now that no one can run away from his end. It is not a good omen for me. And, you can kind of think of this metanomial. It's like Christians refer to God in heaven. Well, if God's omnipresent, it's more than just in heaven. But a lot of religions refer to God as heaven, but Islam uses the phrase, but then says that God is closer to you than your jugular vein and all-encompassing, so not just, outside Earth, But they're not really saying that God is incarnate through the sky or that sort of thing. The Mongols, I guess they weren't saying that either. Well, Islam definitely doesn't say that, but, he took to drinking again in his couch. At the beginning of the 12th moon, he sat late to drink one night with two companions, one being the sister of Si Urkuktiti, the other her nephew, who had come on a visit from Cathay. Ogedai welcomed them, and emptied cups of hot and cold wine with them. That night he died in his sleep. At daybreak, when other women found Ogedai's body, the wailing began. The accusations against the two who had sat with Ogedai in the night. Some say that Si Urkuktiti's sister had poisoned the Khakan. Ilchidai Noyan, a powerful chieftain of the Jalairs, spoke against this. What scattered words are these, he exclaimed. The Khakan hath ever drunk too much of wine. Why then should we give our Khakan a bad name, saying that he died at the hand of another? For this hour was upon him. Let no man speak such words again. The Mongols are heard. Ilchidai nodded their heads in agreement. Ogedai, their Khakan, had ascended to the throne seat of empire. They remembered in the year of the ox. And now that 12 years had passed, he had died in that same year of the ox. It seemed fitting enough. Just like, when people die at the same calendar date of the year, there's perhaps as they were born, perhaps people can find meaning with that. As their custom was, they kept the news a secret. At daybreak, when Ogedai lay lifeless by the Blue Lake, orders were given to close the post roads. No merchants or strangers were allowed within the gates of Kara Korum. No Mongol could leave the Blue Lake encampment except the couriers who carried tidings to the bloodkin of the Golden family. Travelers on the roads were halted at the stations, and the couriers went through on racing horses. One quested for and found Kuyuk loitering near the Gobi. Another, with a golden tablet that gave him the authority of a Khakan, galloped across Asia in midwinter, sleeping in the saddle as he went to carry the tidings to Supatai and Batu. Ogedai had died on the 11th of December, 1241 of the Common Era. The courier arrived at Supatai's quarters on the Danube Lake late in February. He had covered nearly 5,000 miles of snow trails in 2 months and a half, and this courier brought a summons to Batu and the chieftains of the house of Genghis Khan to ride back to the Mongol homeland, to a Kurultai of the blood kin. To disobey such a summons was to Subutai unthinkable. Now it was Batu's turn to object, and I don't think my stomach is objecting by its growling. Ogadai's death has been a release to him. By it, the bastard son had become the eldest of the house of Genghis Khan, for Chagatai was aged, his health broken by heavy drinking. More than that, Batu commanded the victorious army of the West. His dominion had grown with each yearly campaign. He had no desire to quit the Danube to journey back to Karakorum to help elect one of his cousins of the house of Ogadai to the great Khan's throne. Certainly not Kuyuk, who had called him an old woman with a beard. Batu wished, therefore, to carry on the war. Had not that been Ogadai's command? Subutai, indifferent to politics, answered that the Yasa, the word of Genghis Khan, summoned them to the homelands. He thought no more of his own ambition to penetrate beyond the Danube. Back they must go, and he ordered the evacuation of Europe. Kadan was called off from his manhunt. The great Ordu about faced and began his slow march eastward to the steppes. But Subutai took pains to make the Europeans understand that this was no retreat. To circle his movement, Kaidu was sent with a flying column to circle Vienna and carry off loot from the Germans. As they went, Kaidu's riders proclaimed, "We are called away, and we spare the Germans war." The Mongols decided to abandon the Hungarian plateau zone. They stripped the plain of its herds, driving the cattle eastward. This zone in which they had been settling was to be turned into a desert. Kadan's army was ordered back through the Balkans to crush the Serbs and Bulgars there. In its passing, it burned Belgrade and compelled the Bulgars to become tributaries of the Khan. Then it rejoined Subutai in the Russian steppes. Their new frontier was to be the end of these grasslands at the line of the Balkans, the Transylvanian Alps, and the Carpathians with their wagon trains. They disappeared into the east. Europe had been granted a truce. What would have happened if Ogadai had not died? Would Western Europe have escaped the Mongol yoke? This much is certain. Subutai had come into contact with the German military power, and it was part of the Mongol plan of conquest not to leave a defiant enemy uncrushed. It is clear also that the steppe dwellers felt little desire for the hilly country beyond the Danube. With its small valleys and rivers, they had been drawn toward the steppes of Russia, the Polish plain, and the Hungarian plateau. That they would have destroyed Frederick and his war bands, there can be no doubt, and the French chivalry, led by the hapless Louis, might have fared no better. The European monarchs had proved themselves incapable of acting together in numbers and individual bravery. The Europeans were at least the equals of the Mongols, but they had shown themselves helpless before the maneuvering of the Mongol cavalry divisions, directed by a strategist like Subutai. As it was, Subutai's campaign had a decisive effect on the growth of Eastern Europe. His armies had decimated and scattered the Western Slavs and Magyars. The zone around Hungary had been half depopulated. Crops had not been sown that summer, and famine and typhoid thinned the surviving peoples. On the other hand, the Germans beyond Bohemia had escaped with little harm. Districts like Silesia and fertile Moravia were repopulated in time by German settlers. Teutonic Austria had gained the ascendancy over the sadly mixed survivors of Hungary. The Turkish element in Europe, Bulgars and Kipchaks, were driven into that refuge of minorities. The Balkan mountains are that they were drawn into the orderly mass of the Golden Horde in the steppes. By this upheaval of peoples, the Mongols changed the racial map of that part of Europe, not by interbreeding. The steppe dwellers avoided settling in those lands. They were still nomads by temperament, and they withdraw with their gleanings from the captured lands, leaving almost no descendants there. The children of the women they took east with them grew up in the steppes. 4. Batu withdrew to the Volga banks before settling down with his golden horde. In their retreat, the Mongols disappeared from the ken of the Europeans. The Westerners in that summer of 1242 of the Common Era were left stunned. They felt helpless and uncertain. They asked themselves who the Tartars were and whether they had gone. What purpose had brought them out of the east? When would they strike again? The Eastern churches inserted a new prayer in their litany to be delivered from the fury of the Tartars. A new pope, Innocent the Fourth, coming into the Lateran, warned the Europeans to fortify themselves against the Mongol peril. He heard that the invaders had appeared north of the Holy Land and that Russia was no more. He advised his peoples to obstruct all roads leading into the east, and he sent his missionary friars after the retreating armies toward the unknown empire beyond the steppes to exhort them from ceasing to slaughter mankind. But at the same time, merchants like the Polo brothers began to explore the caravan routes beyond the ruins of Kiev to resume their trade with them. Batu stopped at the line of the Volga, where the courts of his 26 wives awaited him. All his life, he had been little better than an exile from the Golden Family. Now he had, under his gilded domes, the spoils of the European war. He had a domain that was a sea of grass. He was safe from any enemy, with food enough to keep his people from hunger indefinitely. He reigned, a Sign Khan in truth, over an empire more suited to the nomads than Gathai, and he made up his mind to do something unheard of. He told Subutai that he would not go to the Kuriltai. "You are the eldest prince," Subutai said. "It is not wise to refuse." Batu made an excuse. The gout in his leg had kept him from going, the great ancestor said. Subutai reminded him, "Yet those who do not appear at the gathering of the bloodkin will be like arrows shot into reeds. They will disappear." Then Batu agreed that he would make the journey east, but when Subutai departed with his followers, the Sign Khan did not come after him. Instead, he sent word that his gout was worse and he could not come. The Kuriltai was held without him.